before Anne Boleyn was ever born, before her name was whispered in the courts of England. The world into which she would step was already one of power, ambition, and fragile order. To understand Anne Boleyn, the woman who would change England forever, we must first travel back to the beginning of the 16th century. England was a kingdom still shaping itself, caught between the shadows of the medieval world and the dawn of the modern age. The Wars of the Roses had only recently ended, a brutal conflict that tore noble families apart and left the crown insecure. From this bloodshed rose the Tudor dynasty, a family untested, fragile, and deeply aware that their grip on power was not guaranteed. Henry VII, the first Tudor king, had secured the throne by victory in battle and by careful political maneuvering. He was a cautious ruler, more concerned with stability and money than glory or conquest. His reign restored order, but it also bred resentment. Heavy taxes and his obsession with financial security left many nobles wary of his rule. Yet he gave England something it desperately needed: peace. It was into this new peace that his son, Prince Henry, grew. Born in 1491, the second son of Henry VII, he was not expected to be king. That role was meant for his elder brother, Prince Arthur. Arthur was groomed to inherit the throne, trained in the art of kingship, and destined to unite England with Spain through marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the most powerful monarchs of the age. But fate would intervene. In 1502, Arthur died suddenly, leaving the young Henry as heir. At just 11 years old, Henry's life was transformed. He was now the focus of his father's hopes, the bearer of Tudor destiny. When Henry VII died in 1509, the crown passed to this young, energetic, and charismatic prince. At only 17 years old, Henry VIII ascended the throne, a striking contrast to his cautious father. He was athletic, educated, charming, and determined to make England a kingdom of glory. To secure his dynasty and strengthen England's ties to Spain, he married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon. With papal approval, their union was declared valid. For a time, all seemed secure. England had a handsome young king, a respected queen, and the promise of heirs to continue the Tudor line. But beneath the pageantry, England remained a kingdom of tension. Its power was limited compared to the great empires of Spain and France. Its monarchy was new, its legitimacy fragile, and looming above all was the Catholic Church, an institution that dominated every corner of Europe. In the early 16th century, the Catholic Church was more than a faith. It was the political, cultural, and spiritual foundation of Christendom. The Pope in Rome held authority not only over souls, but over kings. Every marriage, every birth, every death was tied to the Church. Priests preached obedience, monasteries commanded wealth, and bishops sat in parliament. To question the Church was to question the natural order of the world. Henry VIII, like all rulers of his age, was raised to revere Rome. He was a devout Catholic, educated in theology, and even prided himself on his learning. In time, he would earn the title Defender of the Faith for his writings against Martin Luther, the German monk whose protests were shaking Europe. Yet beneath this seemingly unshakable order, cracks were beginning to form. Across the continent, murmurs of discontent grew louder. Corruption within the Church, indulgences, wealth, and the scandal of immoral clergy eroded trust. Scholars began to question papal authority, and reformers whispered of returning to the true gospel. The seeds of the Reformation had been planted, though no one yet knew how far they would grow. England, however, seemed insulated. Here, loyalty to Rome was strong, and Henry showed no sign of breaking from tradition. His queen, Catherine of Aragon, was beloved for her piety, and his court glittered with the promise of renewal. Tournaments, feasts, and music filled the halls of Hampton Court and Westminster. The people rejoiced in their young monarch, and yet, beneath the surface of this glittering court, destiny waited. Henry and Catherine struggled to produce a male heir. Their first child, a daughter named Mary, survived, but sons were lost in infancy, one after another. For a king obsessed with securing his dynasty, this was no small matter. Without a son, the Tudor line would remain fragile, vulnerable to the ambitions of rivals. Into this world of fragile dynasties, religious dominance, and political uncertainty, Anne Boleyn was born, sometime around 1501. Her family, the Boleyns, were ambitious courtiers. Not noble in the highest sense, but skilled in navigating the treacherous waters of Tudor ambition. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a diplomat and courtier, a man who understood that service to the crown was the surest path to advancement. Anne's childhood would be shaped not in the quiet manners of England, but in the dazzling courts of Europe. She was sent abroad to learn refinement, languages, and the art of courtly grace. In the Netherlands, she studied under the Archduchess Margaret of Austria, one of the most powerful women of her age. Later, in France, she absorbed the elegance and sophistication of the French court, where queens and noblewomen wielded influence not only in private, but in politics and religion. By the time Anne returned to England, she was no ordinary lady. She was clever, cultured, and unlike the women of Henry's court. She carried with her the spirit of Europe's Renaissance, its art, its wit, and its daring new ideas. But Anne's story was not yet to begin. For now, England belonged to Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII, a king who sought glory on the battlefield and honor in the eyes of Rome. He launched campaigns in France, sought to rival the great monarchs of Europe, and filled his court with spectacle. But as the years passed, the cracks deepened. No son was born to Catherine. Henry's passions, once devoted to his queen, began to wander. This was the world before Anne Boleyn, a kingdom still haunted by the memory of civil war, a young dynasty desperate for survival, a church that bound all men and women in its grasp, a king yearning for glory, but shackled by fate. And soon, into this carefully balanced world, would step a woman unlike any England had ever seen. A woman whose very presence would alter the course of history. Anne Boleyn. But before she would change England forever, she would have to capture the heart of its king and set in motion a revolution that would shatter the old world. Anne Boleyn's story did not begin in a palace or a throne room. She was not born into the highest rank of nobility, nor was her future written in destiny. Instead, her origins were those of a rising family, ambitious, cunning, and determined to climb the ladder of Tudor favor. Anne was born around the year 1501, though historians continue to debate the exact date. Some argue for 1500, others for 1507. What matters is that she entered the world at a time when England was ruled by Henry VII, a king preoccupied with securing the fragile Tudor dynasty. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was a man of intelligence and skill. He was no great lord, but he was resourceful, well-educated, and determined to rise. Thomas served as a diplomat, a courtier, and a trusted servant of the crown. His talents in language and negotiation carried him across Europe on delicate missions. His loyalty and usefulness won him land, titles, and most importantly, connections. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Howard, was of noble blood. She belonged to the powerful Howard family, one of the most influential dynasties in England. The Howards were ambitious, proud, and relentless in their pursuit of power. Through Elizabeth, Anne inherited not only noble lineage but also the fierce will of a family that believed itself destined for greatness. Anne was not an only child. She grew up alongside her sister, Mary Boleyn, and her brother, George. Together, the three Boleyn children would come to play pivotal roles in the drama of Henry VIII's reign. But among them, it was Anne who would leave the most indelible mark. From her earliest years, Anne was prepared not for domestic quiet, but for service at court. In Tudor England, daughters of ambitious families were not merely daughters. They were pawns, instruments, and sometimes weapons. Their marriages could secure alliances, their presence at court could win favor, and their charm could advance their family's fortunes. Anne's life would prove all of this, and more. But before she could take her place at the glittering courts of kings, Anne would be given an education unlike most English girls of her time. Around 1513, when Anne was still a child, her father secured for her a placement in the household of Margaret of Austria, the Archduchess of the Netherlands. This was no ordinary household. Margaret was the daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian and aunt to Charles V, who would one day rule Spain, the Netherlands, and much of Europe. She was one of the most powerful women in Christendom, and her court was a hub of diplomacy, culture, and Renaissance thought. For a girl like Anne, this was the beginning of transformation. At Margaret's court, Anne absorbed refinement. She learned French, the language of diplomacy, and polished her manners to a level far beyond what an English country household could teach. She was introduced to music, dance, literature, and the art of conversation. She saw firsthand how women, when placed in positions of influence, could wield authority with subtlety and grace. The Archduchess Margaret, herself a shrewd politician, took notice of Anne's intelligence and lively spirit. Though Anne was still young, she impressed those around her. Letters from Margaret describe Anne as a girl so bright and pleasant for her young age that she quickly became a favorite. Here, Anne began to see the world as larger than England, larger than the narrow limits of a court still half in the Middle Ages. She tasted the Renaissance, with its brilliance, its art, and its daring new ideas. But her journey did not end in the Netherlands. From there, she was sent to France, a land that would shape her character even more profoundly. In 1514, Anne entered the service of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's younger sister. Mary had been married off to King Louis XII of France, and Anne traveled with her as part of her retinue. Though Louis died only months after the wedding, Anne remained in France, entering the household of Queen Claude, the young wife of King Francis I. It was here, at the French court, that Anne truly came of age. The French court of Francis I was unlike anything Anne had ever known. It was dazzling, cosmopolitan, and filled with intrigue. Francis himself was a patron of the arts, a lover of grandeur, and a man whose court overflowed with poets, scholars, and courtiers. It was also a place of moral complexity, known both for its brilliance and for its decadence. In the service of Queen Claude, Anne learned not only etiquette but the subtler arts of survival. Claude was deeply pious, but she was surrounded by courtiers who schemed and whispered, who used charm and wit as tools of advancement. Anne absorbed all of it. She studied how women could navigate power in a man's world, not by brute force, but by intelligence, charm, and careful calculation. She also refined her education. In France, Anne perfected her French to the point of fluency, a rare skill among English ladies. She learned to play instruments, to sing gracefully, to dance with elegance. She acquired the poise of a continental courtier and the sophistication of a woman who belonged not only to England, but to Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Anne encountered the new religious and intellectual currents that were stirring across the continent. France was a hotbed of humanist thought, where scholars discussed reforming the church, purifying faith, and returning to the scriptures. These ideas were not yet revolutionary, but they were seeds that would later bear fruit in Anne's own convictions. Anne's charm and wit did not go unnoticed. She became known as a woman of elegance, one who could command attention not through beauty alone, but through conversation, intelligence, and a captivating presence. Unlike her sister Mary, who by many accounts was considered more physically attractive, Anne possessed a magnetism that drew people in. She had a sharpness, a wit, and an energy that made her unforgettable. Years in France gave Anne something rare among English women: a worldly education, a polish that blended piety with sophistication, and an ability to navigate the subtleties of court life. When she finally returned to England, she was unlike any other lady in Henry's court. While Anne grew abroad, her family's fortunes rose at home. Thomas Boleyn advanced steadily in Henry VIII's service, securing estates and favor. The Howard connection gave the Boleyns powerful allies at court, and every step forward increased their ambition. Her sister Mary, too, had entered the king's orbit. By the mid-1520s, Mary Boleyn had become the mistress of Henry VIII. Though the affair was not as famous as Anne's future relationship, it elevated the Boleyn family further. Thomas Boleyn was rewarded with titles and lands, and the Boleyns secured their place among the rising stars of Tudor England. When Anne returned to England around 1522, she was no longer a child. She was a young woman, educated, refined, and ready to make her mark. She first appeared at court in a performance of the Chateau Vert, a pageant in which she played the role of Perseverance. It was a fitting role, for perseverance would become the defining quality of her life. Her presence at court caused a stir. Unlike many of the ladies who surrounded Catherine of Aragon, Anne was sophisticated, witty, and different. She carried herself with a confidence and elegance shaped by the courts of Europe. She stood apart, and in a court where standing apart could mean everything, Anne was poised for destiny. At this moment, Anne could not yet have known the role she would play. She could not have known that she would one day stand at the very heart of England's greatest political and religious upheaval. She could not have known that she would become queen, or that she would lose her head on the orders of the very man who once adored her. But the elements were already in place. A family ambitious for power, a young woman educated in the courts of Europe, refined and ambitious in her own right, and a kingdom ruled by a king restless for change, desperate for a son, and eager for something, someone, that could transform his destiny. Anne's early life had prepared her for what was to come, but the true storm was only just beginning. Soon, Henry VIII's gaze would fall upon her, and nothing in England would ever be the same. Anne Boleyn returned to England in 1522. She was no longer the child who had left years before. The Anne who stepped back onto English soil carried with her the refinement of the Netherlands, the sophistication of France, and the rare poise of a woman trained not only in manners, but in the subtle arts of influence. Her French was fluent, her style cosmopolitan, her mind sharp. She was not the most beautiful woman in the court. Many would later remark that her sister Mary was the prettier of the two. But Anne possessed something more dangerous than beauty. She had wit, she had presence, and she had the kind of magnetic energy that made men remember her long after she had left the room. It was this Anne who entered the service of Queen Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first wife. Catherine was a woman of dignity, deeply religious, and respected by the people. For more than a decade, she had been the loyal partner of the king. But by 1522, the cracks in their marriage were beginning to show. Henry and Catherine had only one surviving child, a daughter named Mary. The king longed for a son, a male heir who would secure the Tudor dynasty. Sons had been born, but each had died in infancy. Catherine was now in her late 30s, her health strained by repeated pregnancies. The hope of more children was fading, and with it, Henry's patience. Henry was a man of appetite, both for glory and for pleasure. His wandering eye often strayed to the ladies of his court. One of those women was Mary Boleyn, Anne's elder sister. Mary had been Henry's mistress for a time, though the affair was discreet compared to what would later unfold with Anne. Still, it brought the Boleyn family closer to the king's orbit. When Anne arrived, she was placed as a maid of honor to Queen Catherine. This gave her access to the heart of court life, where every gesture, every word, and every glance carried weight. She participated in masques, pageants, and feasts. She conversed with courtiers, listened to gossip, and observed the queen. But most importantly, she came within sight of Henry VIII himself. At first, Anne did not stand out as a rival to the queen or as a temptation for the king. She was simply another young lady of the court. But to those who paid attention, Anne was different. She dressed with a flair that reflected her years in France, elegant yet bold, with French fashions that drew attention in the plainer English court. She spoke with charm, her words sharpened with intelligence. She could sing, dance, and play instruments with skill, but what truly set her apart was her ability to command conversation. In a court filled with ladies trained to flatter and obey, Anne was daring. She spoke her mind, she teased, she challenged. She had the courage to say no, even to powerful men. And that, more than anything, intrigued Henry VIII. By the mid-1520s, Henry's attention turned toward Anne. At first, it may have been nothing more than flirtation, the king's natural appetite for conquest. But Anne was not like her sister Mary, nor the countless other women who had briefly entertained Henry's fancy. When Henry approached Anne, she refused him. This was not coyness alone. It was strategy. Anne knew what her sister's affair with the king had brought. Momentary attention, but little lasting security. She understood that to surrender quickly would be to become another discarded mistress. Instead, Anne drew a line Henry had not expected. She would not give herself to him, at least not in the way he demanded. Her refusal only deepened his desire. Henry VIII was not a man accustomed to denial. He was the King of England, master of his realm, and most women at court saw submission as both duty and opportunity. But Anne's resistance set her apart. She became the unattainable prize, the forbidden fruit, the one woman who could say no to a king and survive. Henry was both infuriated and enthralled. He began to write to her, love letters filled with longing and passion. In them, he pleaded for her affection, swore devotion, and promised her gifts. Anne responded carefully. She accepted his letters but gave little in return. She allowed his attention but refused his advances. She offered flirtation but not surrender. It was a dangerous game, but one she played with remarkable skill. Anne understood something fundamental. Henry was not just a man. He was a king. To bind him to her, she could not be his mistress. She had to be something more. She had to offer him not momentary pleasure, but lasting fulfillment. And so, Anne dangled the possibility of herself, but only on the condition of marriage. For Henry, this was unthinkable. He was already married to Catherine of Aragon, whose position as queen was sanctioned by the Church and blessed by Rome. To cast her aside for another woman would be scandalous, dangerous, even sacrilegious. And yet, the more Anne resisted, the more Henry's obsession grew. By the late 1520s, the king's infatuation with Anne Boleyn was no longer a secret. The court buzzed with whispers. Catherine of Aragon, who had endured her husband's affairs before, could not ignore this one. For Anne was not like the others. Catherine saw in Anne a rival not only for Henry's affection, but for her very crown. Though Catherine remained dignified and steadfast, she could not give Henry what he wanted most: a son. Anne, young and fertile, represented the possibility of heirs. The rivalry between Catherine and Anne was not always direct, but it was unmistakable. Anne's presence at court was a constant reminder to Catherine of her husband's wandering heart. Catherine clung fiercely to her role as queen, drawing on her deep faith and the support of her nephew, Emperor Charles V of Spain. She believed her marriage was lawful, sanctioned by God, and unbreakable. Anne, meanwhile, grew bolder. She surrounded herself with allies, including her brother George and her father Thomas, who understood the stakes of her position. The Boleyn family recognized that Anne's relationship with the king could elevate them all to heights they had never dreamed of. Henry, caught between his queen and his desire, began to see his marriage to Catherine not only as a personal frustration, but as a political problem. Without a male heir, the Tudor dynasty remained insecure. Without Anne, he was restless and unfulfilled. The stage was set for conflict, not just between two women, but between England and Rome itself. As Henry's obsession with Anne deepened, the court divided. Some supported Catherine, respecting her piety, her dignity, and her lawful position as queen. Others, eager for advancement, aligned themselves with Anne and the Boleyn faction. Whispers spread through the halls of Hampton Court and Westminster. Was it possible that the king might cast aside his wife of 2 decades for this young woman? Could Henry dare to challenge the church itself in pursuit of Anne? For now, the outcome was uncertain. But one thing was clear. Anne Boleyn had risen from a maid of honor to the center of England's greatest drama. She had captured the heart of the king, ignited the jealousy of a queen, and set the entire kingdom on a path toward upheaval. Anne's rise was not yet complete. She was still only the king's beloved, not his wife, not his queen. Her power remained precarious, dependent on Henry's will and the outcome of his struggle with Rome. But even at this early stage, Anne Boleyn had changed everything. She had awakened in Henry VIII a passion so consuming that he was willing to risk scandal, rebellion, and even damnation. She had transformed herself from the daughter of an ambitious courtier into the woman who stood at the very heart of England's destiny. The rivalry with Catherine of Aragon had begun. The king's obsession was now unshakable, and the kingdom itself was teetering on the edge of transformation. Anne Boleyn was no longer just a lady of the court. She was a force, a storm gathering strength, and soon she would bring the world crashing down. The court of Henry VIII, once a place of vibrant music, tournaments, and display, was now shadowed by a question so vast that it would shake Christendom itself. It began with a desire, simple in its phrasing yet catastrophic in its consequence. The King of England wished to rid himself of his lawful wife, Queen Catherine of Aragon, and marry Anne Boleyn. But this was no private longing, no affair of the heart alone. This was the great matter, a crisis of church and state, of marriage and power, of conscience and ambition, that would rupture England from Rome and set the kingdom on a perilous new path. Catherine of Aragon was no ordinary wife to discard. The daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile, aunt to the powerful Emperor Charles V, she was a woman of dignity, resilience, and fierce devotion to her role as queen. She had endured miscarriages and stillbirths, yet remained steadfast, refusing to acknowledge any illegitimacy in her marriage. To Henry, however, her inability to produce a surviving male heir was evidence of divine disfavor. To Anne, it was opportunity. Henry scoured Scripture, finding in the book of Leviticus what seemed to him divine sanction, that no man should marry his brother's widow, lest he be left childless. Catherine had been wed to Arthur, Henry's elder brother, before marrying him. Was this why no son survived? In Henry's mind, God himself had cursed the union, but Catherine fought back. She swore before God and man that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated. She declared herself the true wife and queen. To surrender her crown would not only betray her daughter, Princess Mary, but would imperil the very order of the kingdom. Anne Boleyn, no longer content to linger on the margins of court, now stood at the very center of Henry's obsession. Yet she was not simply a passive prize awaiting rescue. Anne became a political player, guiding Henry, whispering counsel, surrounding herself with allies among the reformist and humanist factions. She refused to yield her virtue, denying Henry the intimacy he so desperately sought. In this, she gained leverage. She positioned herself as the woman who could give him both passion and sons, but only through marriage. Her letters to Henry reveal her shrewdness, alternately tender and distant, warm and sharp. She drew him deeper into her orbit. She would not be a mistress, she insisted. She would be queen, or nothing. To achieve this, Henry needed a papal annulment. At first he was confident. Popes had granted annulments before. Kings were not denied. Yet the timing could not have been worse. The Pope, Clement VII, was at that very moment a prisoner of Charles V, Catherine's nephew, after the sack of Rome in 1527. To favor Henry against Catherine was to humiliate the most powerful ruler in Europe. Clement hesitated, delayed, and evaded. Henry grew furious. He dispatched Cardinal Wolsey, his most trusted minister, to secure the annulment. Wolsey's reputation as a master diplomat was legendary, but even he could not bend the will of Rome against the emperor. The papal court sent legates to England, heard arguments, but gave no judgment. The matter dragged on year after year, gnawing at Henry's pride and testing Anne's patience. In 1529, Catherine and Henry faced one another publicly at the Blackfriars Court in London. It was a scene of high drama. Before cardinals, nobles, and courtiers, Catherine knelt before her husband and pleaded her case. "My lord, I take God and all the world to witness that I have been to you a true, humble, and obedient wife. If I have offended you, it is only in love." She declared she had never been Arthur's wife in more than name, that her marriage to Henry was lawful, that she would not yield. Henry, red-faced and humiliated, turned away. The Legatine court adjourned without resolution. The Pope revoked the case to Rome. Catherine remained queen. Wolsey's failure sealed his downfall, and Anne's faction triumphed. In the vacuum left by Wolsey, Anne's influence deepened. She promoted reformist churchmen, Thomas Cranmer, Thomas Cromwell, who believed not in begging Rome's permission, but in asserting England's independence. Anne was no theologian, but she understood the power of ideas. She encouraged Henry to read reformist texts, works that questioned papal supremacy and emphasized royal authority. She placed in his hands William Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man, a book that argued kings, not popes, were God's anointed rulers on earth. Henry seized upon the argument with relish. Why should he, a king anointed by God, bow to the will of a foreign bishop in Rome? Even as politics raged, the court itself became a theater of seduction and fear. Anne dazzled in masks and pageants, her French gowns and sharp wit making her the envy and rival of noblewomen. But whispers circulated that she was bewitching the king, that she was too bold, too ambitious, too dangerous. Men fell under her charm, women scorned her. Courtiers divided into factions, Boleyn supporters versus Aragon loyalists. At every feast, every dance, every hunt, one could feel the tension beneath the gilded surface. Anne had risen high, but with that rise came peril. Each day she remained uncrowned. Her enemies sharpened their knives. By 1530, Henry was no longer pleading with Rome. He was plotting to sever England's ties entirely. Parliament was pressured to pass laws limiting papal authority. Cranmer was elevated to Archbishop of Canterbury, ready to declare Henry's first marriage invalid. Anne's moment of triumph was nearing, but even she could not foresee the cost. The break with Rome would unleash a storm, monasteries dissolved, saints' shrines destroyed, England torn by rebellion and bloodshed. And yet, it all began here, with a king's desire, a queen's refusal, and a woman who dared to hold out for a crown. This was the great matter, not merely a king's divorce, but a struggle that reordered the very soul of England. Catherine's dignity, Henry's pride, Anne's ambition, and Rome's hesitation. Together they formed the crucible in which the English Reformation was forged. And Anne, once a courtier's daughter from Kent, stood at its very heart, shaping the destiny of a nation with every step she took closer to the throne. London wakes not to morning bells, nor to the grim tidings of plague or rebellion, but to the rolling chime of celebration. Across the spires of the city, from St. Paul's Cathedral to the small parish towers that crowd its winding streets, the bells toll in unison. They echo over the Thames, ripple across the fields that stretch beyond the city walls, and mingle with the shouts of merchants, children, and priests preparing for a spectacle unlike any in living memory. Yet for all their music, the bells do not bring only joy. With every toll, they strike discord as well as harmony. For some they ring of triumph, of a new age, a new queen, a future secured. For others they toll with foreboding, announcing not glory, but calamity. The reason for this dissonance is one woman, Anne Boleyn. Her coronation is the culmination of nearly a decade of struggle. For 7 years, Henry VIII waged his battle against the immovable forces of tradition, marriage, and papal authority. The matter of his divorce from Catherine of Aragon had consumed not only the king, but also the kingdom itself. It was no mere domestic quarrel. It was Europe's drama, Rome's crisis, Christendom's scandal. Foreign ambassadors wrote in secret letters of Henry's obsession, his endless pursuit, his refusal to be thwarted. Priests thundered against the king's defiance from pulpits abroad, while in England, cautious silence often replaced open condemnation. Catherine's cause had become a symbol of righteousness, her endurance a mark of sanctity. Anne, meanwhile, was painted as enchantress, temptress, and destroyer of queens. Now, with the stroke of defiance, Henry had broken from Rome. He had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, rejecting the Pope's supremacy and daring to cast aside centuries of religious order. And all of it, this revolution in throne and altar, was for Anne. Her coronation, therefore, was not merely a ceremony. It was a proclamation, a declaration written not only in gold and silk, but in defiance and blood. As dawn rises, the city itself seems reborn. The narrow, filthy streets, where carts groan under their loads of fish and wool, and where beggars cry out for alms, have been swept and scrubbed for days in preparation. Wooden platforms line the route from the Tower of London to Westminster. Banners of crimson and azure flutter from timbered houses. From the windows, rich merchants hang tapestries of velvet and brocade, while poorer households place garlands of flowers, wild and fragrant, across their sills. The Thames, too, prepares for its part in the drama. Barges are adorned with flags, their sails painted with the arms of the king and his new queen. Trumpeters gather in clusters, ready to sound their fanfares as Anne passes. Musicians wait on bridges, their lutes and pipes tuned to fill the air with song. The city is a stage. Every cobblestone, every lantern, every archway has been pressed into service for one singular purpose: to crown the woman who has divided England. From the Tower, Anne emerges not as mistress or lady-in-waiting, but as queen-to-be. She steps onto her barge, gilded and dazzling, its prow shaped like a swan, its canopy rich with cloth of gold. As the oars dip into the Thames, the river erupts into color and sound. Hundreds of vessels surround her, each hung with banners, each straining for a glimpse of the woman who has overturned a kingdom. Trumpets blare, drums thunder. Music rolls across the water like waves themselves. For many, it is a sight of breathtaking beauty, a vision of majesty floating upon the river of England's heart. For others, it is a spectacle of arrogance, an insult to the true queen, Catherine, who even now waits in lonely defiance, refusing to surrender her title. Anne sits serenely, her face unreadable, her dark eyes fixed ahead. The cheers of the crowd rise and fall. Some voices ring with genuine devotion, but others, muted, hesitant, betray the reluctance of hearts still loyal to Catherine. Beneath the cheers, there are mutterings: concubine, usurper, witch, but the procession sails on. The morning of June 1st arrives. Anne is arrayed in robes of white and cloth of gold, her long black hair flowing free beneath a delicate crown. Unlike Catherine before her, she does not wear the heavy crown of a reigning queen, but a lighter one, a compromise, yet still dazzling in its brilliance. To her supporters, she appears radiant, almost divine. To her enemies, the very image of pride. The procession winds through London's streets. At every turn, pageants await her. Children dressed as angels sing hymns of blessing. Actors, painted and costumed, perform allegories of love, fertility, and renewal. One stage proclaims her as the dawn of a golden age, promising that she will bring forth sons to secure England's future. Another depicts Saint Anne, the mother of the Virgin Mary, a not-so-subtle reminder that Anne's very name is linked to sanctity and motherhood. The merchants present her with costly gifts: cups of silver, bolts of fine cloth, baskets of exotic fruit. Nobles bow low as she passes, their faces masks of loyalty, though some conceal clenched jaws and silent resentment. The people themselves are harder to read. Some cheer until their voices crack, desperate to please their king. Others stand in stony silence, arms folded, eyes cast down. For all the pageantry, London remains divided, its heart torn between the queen who was and the queen who now rides before them. At last Anne reaches Westminster Abbey. The ancient stones, dark with age, echo with music as choirs sing in soaring Latin. The air smells of incense and candle wax, mingled with the scent of roses strewn along her path. Here, in the holiest place in England, Anne kneels. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, himself a figure of controversy for annulling Henry's first marriage, raises his hands in blessing. He anoints Anne with holy oil. He sets upon her brow the crown of a queen. In that moment, the break with Rome is not only declared, but consecrated. No papal bull can undo it. No foreign monarch can ignore it. Anne Boleyn is now Queen of England, by the will of Henry, by the law of England, by the defiance of Rome. The choir thunders with Te Deum Laudamus, trumpets resound, the crown gleams in the candlelight, and yet behind the majesty lies fragility. Anne's triumph rests not upon universal love or unshakable tradition, but upon Henry's favor, the loyalty of a divided court, and the hope, no, the demand, that she produce a son. That evening, Westminster Hall blazes with light. Golden dishes are piled high with roasted meats and sugared delicacies. Wine flows like water. Musicians play without pause, their lutes and fiddles filling the hall with relentless cheer. Anne sits enthroned, Henry at her side, as courtiers bow and flatter, each word dripping with honeyed praise. To the watching world, it is a night of triumph, the dawn of a new reign. But beneath the music, beneath the feasting, shadows stir. Catherine still lives, exiled but unbroken, still calling herself queen. Abroad, Spain and the Holy Roman Empire whisper of vengeance. In Rome, the Pope declares Henry's actions heresy. Within England, beneath the cheers, there are murmurs of discontent, of prophecy, of doom. Anne knows this. She sees it in the eyes of those who bow too low, who smile too quickly. She feels it in the weight of the crown, light in substance but heavy with expectation. For now she must prove herself not only queen, but mother. She must give Henry the son he craves. Without him, the entire edifice of her triumph, the break with Rome, the coronation, the feasts and pageants, will crumble into dust. Thus Anne Boleyn reaches her greatest height. Adored and reviled, triumphant and imperiled, she sits as queen of a kingdom she has reshaped forever. The crown upon her brow shines brilliantly, but its jewels cut as sharply as they dazzle. For in Tudor England, no crown is secure, and no queen untouchable. Beyond the music, beyond the cheers, somewhere in the gathering night, knives are being sharpened, words whispered in shadows, and fates already written. Anne has risen higher than any woman before her, and yet, as history has taught and will teach again, the higher the rise, the greater the fall. Anne Boleyn had ascended to the pinnacle of power. Crowned Queen of England, adored by her king, feared by her enemies, she had rewritten the rules of the kingdom. The very definition of what a queen could be had been transformed by her wit, charm, and daring. Yet the true test of her queenship was only beginning, not in ceremonies or feasts, not in courtly flattery, but in the relentless, quiet demands of a Tudor monarchy, the pressure to secure the line, to produce the heir that could define history. To wear the crown was to carry not only the weight of glory, but the immeasurable burden of expectation. Every courtier, every servant, every whispering noble watched her, measured her, calculated her. Anne's reign would be defined not only by ambition, but by the delicate, terrifying art of survival. To be queen was one triumph. To be mother of a son was everything. England demanded it. Henry craved it. The dynasty itself depended upon it. Every courtier whispered, every envoy reported, every physician predicted. Anne Boleyn was a queen, but her power was tethered to a simple, terrifying question. Would she bear a male heir? Even the strongest queen could not escape this weight. She who had defied the Pope, outraged Europe and reshaped England, now faced a far more intimate and merciless test: the unpredictability of the female body. Each flutter of life within her womb was magnified into political consequence. Every miscarriage, every faint heartbeat, every day of uncertainty was a battlefield on which the kingdom's future hung. Anne's first pregnancy brought hope to a nation and fear to her enemies. The court buzzed with anticipation. Prayers were whispered in every chapel. Candles flickered before saints' statues, and astrologers consulted their charts. Yet the joy of expectation was fragile. Miscarriages were common, mortality rates high. Every twinge of pain, every moment of faintness, every anxious heartbeat reminded Anne, and all who watched, that the throne was never far from danger. Courtiers spoke in hushed tones, wondering if this queen could deliver the child England so desperately required. Every flutter, every subtle change in her body became public knowledge, discussed in whispers in corridors, reported in letters abroad. No private struggle remained hidden. Her body, once her own, was now the vessel of dynastic hope. In September of 1533, Anne delivered a child, Elizabeth. The court erupted in celebration, but the joy was tempered by reality. A daughter, not the son Henry craved, had come into the world. For Anne, it was a triumph in survival, in the miracle of life itself, yet a reminder that her ultimate goal remained unfulfilled. England's hopes for a male heir rested once more upon her fragile body. The birth of Elizabeth was both blessing and burden. The child would grow to embody her mother's struggle, born into ambition, wrapped in expectation, observed by a kingdom hungry for a male heir and fearful of failure. Anne's love was fierce, yet tempered by the knowledge that her political survival depended on a son, a prince who might never come. In the years that followed, Anne suffered repeated miscarriages, each loss a private tragedy made public by rumor and scrutiny. With each child she lost, Henry's impatience grew. The court whispered more fiercely, and her enemies circled closer. Every heartbeat she felt, or failed to feel, was magnified into a symbol of her worth as queen and mother. These were not merely personal tragedies. They were political crises. Each miscarriage weakened her position, strengthened her rivals, and reminded Henry and all of England that no crown, however golden, could protect a queen from the merciless demands of lineage and legacy. While Anne labored under the demands of motherhood, the court conspired. Jane Seymour and other ladies-in-waiting observed with careful interest, noting every sign of weakness. Thomas Cromwell, ambitious and calculating, maneuvered behind the scenes. Thomas Wyatt monitored allegiances, and every foreign envoy reported their own version of the Queen's vulnerability. Even the King's favor, once Anne's most steadfast shield, could not prevent envy and scheming from gathering like storm clouds. In Tudor England, the line between private grief and political consequence was perilously thin. A queen's miscarriage was never merely personal. It was gossip, rumor, a weapon. Every heartbeat, every whispered breath, every fragile moment of hope could tip the balance of power within the palace and across the kingdom. And yet, Anne endured. Each triumph, each heartbreak, each whisper of doubt forged her into a queen unlike any England had known. She navigated the impossible, courtly expectations, a king's obsession, and the unrelenting pressure to produce an heir. She carried the weight of dynasties on her shoulders, yet moved with grace, wit, and fierce determination. In the struggle to secure a male heir, Anne revealed the paradox of queenship. Power intertwined with vulnerability, triumph shadowed by fragility, ambition tempered by heartbreak. She was both ruler and subject, sovereign and vessel, her life and body inextricably linked to the fate of England itself. Anne Boleyn's queenship was a study in contrasts, glory and vulnerability, triumph and loss, expectation and heartbreak. With the birth of Elizabeth, she secured a legacy, but the kingdom's thirst for a son remained. Each day brought new pressure, each moment a test. In the struggle of motherhood and monarchy, Anne discovered that the crown could shine brilliantly, but its weight could crush even the strongest queen. Every triumph carried the shadow of failure, and every joy was tempered by the whispers of the court, the longing for heirs, and the ruthless expectations of a kingdom poised on the edge of history. The coronation crown still gleamed upon Anne's head, yet beyond the velvet and ceremony, the storm of England's Reformation was gathering its full force. If Anne Boleyn was Henry's queen in name and power, she was also something more dangerous, a symbol of religious transformation, a living embodiment of the rupture that would forever divide England from Rome. To understand Anne's queenship, one must also understand her role in the great religious upheaval of the 16th century. Anne was not a passive figure in this revolution. She was both participant and catalyst. Her personal faith, her patronage of reformers, and her defiance of conservative forces within the court and church all propelled her into history as a woman who changed not just dynasties, but the very soul of England. Anne Boleyn's enemies, both in her own time and in centuries since, often reduced her to a single image: the temptress who lured a king away from his lawful wife, the cunning seductress who toppled a queen and split a kingdom. To Catherine of Aragon's defenders, she was no more than a serpent in velvet, a Jezebel cloaked in jewels. Yet, to those who dared to look closer, past the venom of gossip and the fury of propaganda, there emerges another portrait, that of a woman whose true power was not only in beauty or charm, but in her mind, her learning, and her hunger for knowledge. In an age when queens were expected to embody piety and fertility rather than intellectual vigor, Anne stood apart. She carried books as proudly as she wore pearls. To see her with a manuscript in hand was not unusual, it was habitual. Her shelves contained volumes of theology, devotional works, and translations of the newest, most dangerous reformist texts. Many of these books had crossed the narrow waters of the English Channel in secret, their bindings hidden under cloth, their printers hunted by bishops who called them the devil's work. These were works smuggled in sacks of grain, pressed between bales of cloth, carried by merchants whose lives might be forfeit if they were discovered. Anne not only owned them, she read them, annotated them, and treasured them as guides to faith and destiny. One book, in particular, would change the fate of a kingdom. William Tyndale's The Obedience of a Christian Man was no mere devotional. It was a thunderclap in print. Within its pages lay a radical idea that kings held their authority not through the Pope, nor through the machinery of Rome, but directly from God himself. It stripped away the towering edifice of papal supremacy with a single stroke. For the hierarchy of the medieval church, this was heresy, fire-worthy, dangerous, poison for the soul. For Anne, it was revelation. She is said to have placed this very book into the hands of Henry VIII, at first perhaps in quiet conversation, or perhaps in one of those intimate moments when only husband and wife shared the chambers of Whitehall. One can almost picture the scene. The candlelight flickering across gold leaf margins, Anne's hand guiding Henry's to the crucial passages, her voice, low, persuasive, urging him to see. And Henry, a man ever eager for arguments that flattered his will, found in its words the very justification he had sought. Here was permission in ink, divine sanction for rebellion. Here was a vision of kingship unshackled from the Bishop of Rome. If the Pope would not bless his divorce, then perhaps he no longer needed the Pope at all. Through this exchange, Anne did something extraordinary. She became the midwife of an idea. Not merely queen in name, but intellectual partner in revolution. She was the channel through which the king's will met the radical theology of a new age. She fed Henry with words that loosened the iron grip of centuries, whispering scripture and argument into the very ear of monarchy. And this was not a single instance, nor a fleeting fancy. Anne's patronage of reformist works continued, her libraries expanding with titles both sacred and forbidden. She ordered new translations, gifted books to courtiers, and encouraged debate among her household chaplains. To walk into her chambers was to enter not only a royal household, but a salon of theological ferment, a sanctuary for men and women who saw in her patronage the hope of England's renewal. Yet every book she carried, every translation she encouraged, carried weight beyond her chamber walls. Each page was a threat to the stability of an ancient order, each margin note a spark cast against the tinder of Christendom. In her hands, parchment was not mere devotion, it was dynamite, and so to her enemies, the sight of Anne with a book was not innocent, but ominous. To the conservatives, she was not a queen deepening her soul, but a heretic feeding a king with poison. To them she was Eve with the apple, except now the apple was ink and scripture, and its bite threatened to unmake the church itself. But to those who believed the old world must be broken so a new one could be born, Anne Boleyn was a vision of hope. A queen not content with ceremony, not content with embroidered prayers, but one who would stand, defiantly, book in hand, daring to shape the faith of a kingdom. Anne Boleyn did not merely occupy the royal court. She reshaped it into something entirely new, an intellectual and spiritual crossroads where dangerous ideas were debated under the flicker of candlelight. What had once been a court obsessed with pageantry, feasts, and hunting now acquired a new dimension. The quiet hum of whispered theology, the rustle of pages being turned in secret, the cautious yet fervent prayers of men and women daring to imagine a different England. Her chambers at Hampton Court and Whitehall were more than private spaces of luxury. They became sanctuaries for reform-minded scholars, priests, and thinkers who would never have been granted such proximity to power without her protection. Within those walls, Anne gave shelter to voices that, in another time, might have been silenced by the fire of heresy trials. She invited clerics who dared to question the old order, offering them both her ear and her patronage. In her, they saw not just a queen-to-be, but a guardian of the fragile flame of reform. Among those who benefited most from her favor was Thomas Cranmer, a man of sharp intellect and deep conviction. Under Anne's watchful encouragement, he would rise to become Archbishop of Canterbury, ultimately drafting the theological framework that would redefine England's faith. Without Anne's intervention, Cranmer might have remained a minor churchman, his writings overlooked, his influence buried under the conservative tide of the old clergy. Instead, Anne brought him into Henry's orbit, planting seeds that would grow into the roots of Anglican identity. Her influence extended beyond individual figures. She protected scholars who smuggled Tyndale's English Bibles and reformist tracts into London, shielding them from conservative bishops who demanded their imprisonment. She quietly urged Henry to appoint men of learning and conviction to positions of power within the church, thus ensuring that her vision was not merely an idea, but a growing movement. Even the art and atmosphere of her circle began to reflect this transformation. Where once courtly devotion revolved around gilded relics, jeweled rosaries, and portraits of saints, now new motifs emerged. Scripture verses embroidered into hangings, music and hymns that emphasized the Word of God over the intercession of saints, illuminated manuscripts that celebrated the authority of the king as much as the authority of heaven, subtle changes but deliberate ones, signaling a shift from the old world to something startlingly modern. The court itself became a theater of contrasts. In one chamber, incense still clung to the air as priests chanted the traditional Latin Mass. In another, courtiers gathered around Anne, discussing the radical idea that a believer might approach God directly, without saints or confessionals. Each moment carried danger, for every word of encouragement Anne offered to reformists was, in the eyes of the conservative bishops, an act of heresy. And yet, she persisted. Her court was alive not only with beauty and wit, but with conviction. It was a place where women, often sidelined in matters of religion, found themselves participating in discussions that could shape the future of a kingdom. Ladies-in-waiting studied the scriptures in English. Clerks translated sermons. Musicians composed hymns with subtle reformist undertones. Anne presided over it all, not with the authority of a theologian, but with the passion of someone who knew that ideas, like crowns, could change hands, and with them, the fate of nations. But beneath the music, the laughter, and the scent of wax candles, there lingered an unease. Every whispered prayer, every reformist book passed from hand to hand, was a gamble with death. In England, men had been burned for less. Bishops whispered in corridors, courtiers spread rumors, and conservative forces within the church marked Anne not as a pious queen, but as a dangerous heretic. The transformation of the court under Anne Boleyn was not merely political maneuvering. It was a radical reimagining of what faith, power, and monarchy could be. She carried both the triumph of being a beacon for reform and the shadow of knowing that each act of defiance placed her closer to peril. For Anne, there could be no turning back. The court had become her stage, reform her cause, and the kingdom itself her wager. As Anne Boleyn rose in power, a storm brewed around her, one that was not only political but profoundly spiritual. At the heart of this storm stood Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first queen, whose dignity, piety, and unwavering devotion to Rome made her a formidable symbol of resistance. Catherine's allies were numerous and determined. Members of the court, bishops, scholars, and nobles, each bound by loyalty to the old faith and by fear that Anne's ascent threatened not just a queen, but the very order of Christendom in England. In the flickering candlelight of Westminster and Whitehall, secret meetings were held. Courtiers whispered in corridors, poring over letters and papal edicts. Thomas More, the brilliant humanist and Lord Chancellor, became the face of this conservative opposition. Known for his intellect eloquence, and uncompromising moral compass, More stood as a bulwark against the radical tides Anne was bringing into the heart of England. He questioned the legality of Henry's divorce, denounced the encroachment of the crown on ecclesiastical authority, and argued, quietly, methodically, with the precision of a master jurist, that the Church of Rome must remain England's spiritual anchor. Anne, by contrast, was not simply a rival in courtly intrigue. She was a lightning rod for reform, a living emblem of a new religious and political order that threatened to unseat centuries of tradition. To Catherine's supporters, she was more than a queen. They saw in her a temptress, a dangerous and subversive figure, a modern-day Jezebel whose charms had seduced the king into breaking with God's appointed authority. Every gesture, every smile, every embroidered gown was read as proof of her corruption, and every miscarriage she endured was twisted into a divine warning. God's judgment on a woman daring to claim what did not belong to her. The court became a microcosm of the nation itself, divided between the old and the new. Publicly, Anne maintained the composure and elegance befitting a queen, but behind closed doors, she navigated a labyrinth of distrust, whispers, and hostility. Courtiers loyal to Catherine intercepted letters, spread rumors, and cast suspicious glances, ensuring that Anne's every action was scrutinized, dissected, and weaponized. Even sermons, carefully crafted by reformist clerics, were denounced as heretical, their authors threatened with imprisonment or worse. Yet Anne remained undeterred. She moved with calculated grace through the corridors of power, her intelligence and wit allowing her to parry attacks without seeming to strike. She cultivated alliances, offered patronage to those loyal to reform, and demonstrated a subtle but undeniable control over Henry, whose passions often blinded him to the machinations around him. Every interaction with her rivals was a dance of diplomacy, strategy, and restraint, and so the tension built to a fever pitch. On one side, Catherine's allies, unyielding, moralistic, and deeply loyal to Rome, worked tirelessly to protect the old order. On the other, Anne's faction, bold, reformist, and politically astute, pressed forward with a vision of England reshaped under the authority of the crown and new religious ideas. The court became a theater of spiritual and political warfare, each whisper in the halls echoing far beyond the palace, into the very towns and villages of England. At the center of it all stood Anne Boleyn, admired by some, reviled by others, feared by all. She was a woman navigating perilous currents of ambition, faith, and public scrutiny, whose choices would not only determine her own fate, but the destiny of the English Church itself. Every glance cast her way, every letter written in opposition, every sermon preached against her was a reminder that queenship was never simply ceremonial. It was dangerous, precarious, and fraught with consequences that could reach far beyond the throne. In this crucible, Anne learned the price of power, the cost of ambition, and the brutal realities of being a queen in a divided kingdom. She was both conqueror and target, architect of a new era and lightning rod for resistance. The clash with Catherine's allies was not merely a battle over a marriage. It was a collision of worlds, a confrontation between the old faith and the emerging Reformation, with Anne standing squarely at the fulcrum of England's spiritual and political upheaval. No one embodied the conservative resistance more fully than Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first queen, whose steadfast devotion to the Church of Rome made her a symbol of unyielding piety and legitimacy. Catherine was more than a former queen. She was a living rallying point for those who refused to accept the upheaval Anne Boleyn represented. Around her gathered allies whose loyalty to faith, crown, and tradition was absolute. Bishops, scholars, nobles, and courtiers who feared that England itself was being torn apart. To them, Anne was a dangerous intruder, a foreign seed planted in their midst, threatening not only the queenly order, but the very spiritual fabric of the kingdom. Among these defenders of the old faith, none were more resolute than Sir Thomas More, Lord Chancellor and brilliant humanist scholar. More was a man of conscience and intellect, whose moral compass guided his every decision. He saw the king's desire for a divorce as a violation of God's law and an affront to centuries of established ecclesiastical authority. Quietly but relentlessly, he argued against the annulment, debated the legality of Henry's new marriage, and opposed the growing influence of reformers around Anne. His opposition was subtle, precise, and deeply principled, placing him on an inevitable collision course with Anne's faction, and ultimately with Henry himself. Anne, meanwhile, moved through this minefield of opposition with intelligence and grace. She was not unaware of the threats that surrounded her, the whispered warnings, the scornful glances, the letters circulated behind her back. The conservative faction saw her every action as deliberate seduction, every word as manipulation, and every triumph as proof of her audacity. To them, she was the serpent in the garden, a Jezebel leading the nation towards spiritual ruin. Her every miscarriage, her moments of vulnerability, were twisted into divine judgment. Her successes were recast as dangerous provocations. The tension within the court mirrored the tension across the realm. In council chambers, bishops debated furiously, their voices echoing against stone walls. In private chambers, courtiers whispered rumors of plots and conspiracies, some invented, some real. Even sermons, carefully delivered, were dissected for political undertones. A preacher's support of the Queen could be read as rebellion against God, a warning of doom. England itself seemed to tremble as the forces of tradition and innovation collided. And at the eye of this storm stood Anne Boleyn. Anne was admired for her wit, charm, and political acumen, hated for her perceived audacity and the threat she posed to the old order, feared because of her ability to sway the king, and through him, the destiny of the kingdom. She was at once architect and target, celebrated and vilified, caught between divine expectations and human ambitions. Every courtly smile, every gesture of favor, and every strategic move carried immense weight. To survive, she needed not only courage and intellect, but an almost preternatural awareness of the currents swirling around her. As the struggle intensified, the divisions of the court became stark. Alliances were formed and broken in whispers, letters, and secret meetings. Courtiers aligned themselves either with Catherine's devout faction or Anne's rising circle of reformist supporters. Each side believed the other threatened not only the stability of the throne, but the eternal salvation of England itself. In this high-stakes game, Anne's charm, political skill, and ability to read both men and women became weapons as powerful as any army. Yet, despite the peril, Anne pressed forward. She recognized that the very resistance arrayed against her also illuminated the path to influence. By surviving the scrutiny, outmaneuvering enemies, and consolidating her power in the eyes of Henry, she was not only defending her position, but reshaping the future of the monarchy. In the clash with Catherine's allies, Anne Boleyn was no longer simply a queen. She was a fulcrum on which the fate of England's faith and political order balanced, a woman whose presence alone stirred both devotion and fury, whose decisions would echo across generations. The Reformation Parliament had already been chipping away at the authority of the Pope, passing measure after measure that loosened the bonds tying England to Rome. These laws were subtle at first: regulations about clerical taxes, appeals to papal courts, and questions over church revenues. Yet with every statute, a brick was pried loose from the ancient edifice of papal supremacy in England. It was as though a vast cathedral, standing for 1,000 years, was being dismantled stone by stone, while many whispered whether such a thing could ever truly fall. But the decisive blow came in 1534, with the passing of the Act of Supremacy, a law that declared Henry VIII the supreme head of the Church of England. In a single stroke of the quill, centuries of obedience to Rome were severed. This was no mere administrative reform. It was a revolution in faith, politics, and identity. For nearly a millennium, English Christians had turned their faces toward Rome, believing the Pope to be the final authority on their souls. To shift that allegiance to a mortal king was a rupture of cosmic proportions. And yet, at the very center of this storm stood a woman, Anne Boleyn. Her marriage to Henry was not just a union of man and woman, but a challenge to the entire order of Christendom. She was both catalyst and symbol of the break. Without Anne, Henry might have delayed. Without Anne, the Pope might still have been obeyed. Without Anne, England might have remained bound to Rome for another generation. But Anne's presence, her insistence that she would not yield her body without a crown, her defiance of being made a mere mistress, her embodiment of Henry's desire for a son, forced the issue into crisis. Her enemies spat venomously that she was the cause of schism, the temptress who had lured the king into heresy and rebellion. In sermons, she was likened to Eve, dragging Adam into sin. She was called the concubine, the whore of Babylon, the serpent who had poisoned England's faith. To Catherine's supporters, she was the face of disaster, the reason an entire realm had been torn from the ancient embrace of the Catholic Church. But to her allies, Anne was no temptress. She was an instrument of divine purpose. Reformers who had long prayed for liberation from Rome looked to her as their champion. They whispered that God had sent her to bring forth a new dawn for England. Her interest in Scripture, her possession of forbidden texts such as Tyndale's English Bible, and her conversations with humanist thinkers like Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell, all of these suggested that she was not simply Henry's passion, but a queen with a mission. The rupture with Rome, whether damned or blessed, bore her mark. It may be true that Henry's desire for a male heir drove him to defy the Pope, but Anne's presence turned that desire into a crusade. She gave Henry both the excuse and the resolve to do what no English king had dared. And so in the year 1534, as Parliament proclaimed Henry the supreme head of the Church, England was transformed. Monks and priests were forced to swear oaths to the king. Loyal Catholics who refused, like Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, were imprisoned and executed. The monasteries, symbols of continuity stretching back to the Saxons, began to fall, their treasures seized, their lands plundered. Ordinary men and women, long accustomed to seeing their salvation tied to Rome, were thrust into a new and uncertain spiritual world. And still, Anne stood at the heart of it all. To her supporters, she was the herald of reformation. To her enemies, she was the face of damnation. But no one could deny that without Anne Boleyn, the break may never have come so quickly, so boldly, or so irreversibly. She was both architect and scapegoat, both queen and catalyst. Thus, the Reformation in England was not only the story of theology and politics, it was also the story of one woman whose ambition, intelligence, and unyielding resolve changed the fate of a kingdom forever. Anne Boleyn's reign as queen was not defined solely by glittering crowns and the splendor of coronation. Beneath the jewels and silks, beneath the outward triumph of being Henry's chosen consort and the mother of his heir, there beat the heart of a woman deeply engaged with the spiritual destiny of her kingdom. To some, she was an icon of godly reform. To others, the very embodiment of corruption. In this paradox, Anne lived every day of her queenship balanced precariously between heaven and hell. Her personal piety was both sincere and striking. From her earliest days at court, Anne had shown interest in matters of faith, but as queen, her devotion gained greater purpose. She gave generously to the poor, not in hollow gestures for the sake of appearances, but in consistent acts of charity that reached the humblest of London's citizens. Coins were distributed to beggars who lingered near palace gates. Alms were sent to hospitals, and relief was extended to struggling parish priests. For Anne, charity was not mere performance. It was duty, and it was also politics. Every coin given carried a message. The queen was not only a woman of elegance and charm, but a woman of conscience, a sovereign who believed her reign had spiritual weight. Anne's faith was not cloistered in ritual alone. She had a hunger for scripture, and she nurtured this hunger in others. She funded translations of religious works into English, placing the Word of God directly into the hands of those who had long been denied it. The Latin of the priesthood, once a locked gate keeping ordinary men and women from true understanding, was being dismantled with every book she sponsored. She encouraged preachers who spoke not in the lofty tongue of Rome, but in the language of England's marketplaces and meadows. Sermons delivered in English drew crowds, and though many were scandalized, many more felt, perhaps for the first time, that God was speaking to them directly. Anne even carried her faith into her very garments. She wore, embroidered into her silks, her own personal motto, Ainsi sera, groigne qui groigne. Let them grumble. This is how it shall be. Every stitch was an act of defiance, a banner worn against her detractors. It was not the meek motto of a queen content to submit to courtly expectations. It was a challenge, boldly proclaimed. She would not bow to the whispering lords, the scheming ladies, or the furious ambassadors who called her unworthy. Let them mutter. Let them curse. Let them despise. Still she would rule. Still she would shape her destiny. Still she would drive forward the Reformation that bore her name. Yet, for all this triumph, Anne lived under a constant and suffocating shadow. The kingdom was restless. Not all in England welcomed the break with Rome, nor did all believe in Anne's cause. Whispers clung to her wherever she went. In churches across the land, monks thundered against her from their pulpits, denouncing her as the king's concubine, an adulteress who had seduced the monarch into forsaking God's holy church. In towns and villages, riots flared. Men and women who had once obeyed the crown now risked their lives in open defiance, crying out for their queen to be cast down. Pamphlets, smuggled through secret presses, flooded London. In them, Anne was painted as a Jezebel, a witch, a woman who had bewitched Henry with unnatural charms. In some, crude illustrations depicted her as the whore of Babylon, clad in scarlet, bringing ruin to the realm. These tracts were passed hand to hand in candlelit taverns, hidden beneath cloaks, read in hushed tones by those too fearful to speak their thoughts aloud. Even abroad, the venom flowed freely. Ambassadors in foreign courts reported back to Rome and to the Emperor Charles V that England was no longer a Christian kingdom, but a land devoured by heresy and ruled by a woman's ambition. Anne herself could not have been ignorant of these perceptions. Every glance at court carried with it an unspoken accusation. Every murmured word behind a fan might conceal slander. Yet she walked with her head high, even as the world closed in around her. Her enemies were legion, staunch Catholics loyal to Catherine of Aragon, noble families who saw their own power waning under the rise of the Boleyns, clergymen furious at the loss of their old privileges. But still she pressed forward, convinced that she was chosen, that her marriage, her queenship, even her motherhood, were ordained by divine will. And yet, the line between reform and ruin grew thinner with each passing year. The very forces that had elevated Anne to power now threatened to consume her. The Reformation that had crowned her queen was also tearing apart the foundations of England's faith. Every act of devotion she made was shadowed by accusations of hypocrisy. Every triumph she won was met with the echo of resentment from across the land. Anne Boleyn was a queen caught between heaven and hell, pious and ambitious, devout and defiant, beloved and despised. She was both a torchbearer of reform and a target of hatred. And in that fragile space between light and darkness, she walked the perilous path that would define not only her own fate, but the fate of an entire kingdom. Anne Boleyn's triumph was dazzling, but it was also precarious, because it was not merely a triumph of love or marriage. Her queenship was, in truth, a revolution, and revolutions, for all their promise of renewal, are dangerous things. They tear down walls, but they also unleash forces that can never again be controlled. From the moment Anne accepted Henry's courtship, she stepped into a storm. She was not content to be a passing mistress, a fleeting passion easily discarded. Instead, she demanded a crown, and with that demand, she forced Henry VIII into conflict, not only with his wife, Catherine of Aragon, but with the Pope, the Church, and centuries of tradition. What began as a private romance quickly swelled into a public crisis. Every oath sworn to Rome, every prayer uttered in Latin, every monk cloistered in silence. Suddenly, all were threatened by the king's passion for a woman who refused to be less than a queen. Anne's boldness was her strength, but it was also her vulnerability. She was brilliant, witty, and unafraid to speak her mind in a court where silence was safer than truth. She encouraged Henry to press his case harder, to break with Rome rather than yield to papal delay. She aligned herself with reformers who dreamed of a church purified of corruption, free from papal interference. She patronized scholars, translated works of theology, and placed an English Bible into the king's hands. Each of these acts marked her as a champion of the new order, but each also painted a target on her back. For in supporting reform, Anne was not only aiding Henry's cause, she was reshaping the soul of England. And that reshaping came at a cost. Catherine of Aragon's allies, once merely defenders of a wronged queen, now became defenders of the old faith itself. To them, Anne was not only a rival in love, but an enemy of God. Every sermon that thundered from the pulpit, every rumor whispered in the streets, every pamphlet smuggled into taverns, these sharpened the blade of public opinion against her. She was denounced as a temptress, accused of seducing the king into heresy. The Pope himself declared Henry's new marriage unlawful, making Anne, in the eyes of Rome, nothing more than a concubine and her child Elizabeth illegitimate. Thus, the very legitimacy of the new queen rested not on God's blessing, but on Henry's will alone. Henry's will was powerful, but it was also fickle. He was a man who craved glory and obedience, but also peace of mind. The Reformation Anne had helped ignite did not bring him peace. it brought only further conflict. Bishops resisted, nobles grumbled, commoners rioted. Blood was shed for refusing the oath of supremacy. Treasures of monasteries were seized, lands redistributed, priests humiliated, monks driven from their cloisters. And while reformers rejoiced, the realm trembled. It was in this crucible of unrest that Anne's power began to look less like strength and more like provocation. Her sharp words, once seen as proof of intelligence, now seemed dangerously bold. Her reformist sympathies, once a source of inspiration, became liabilities as Henry wearied of endless quarrels. Every miscarriage she suffered weakened her claim as mother of the Tudor future. Every triumph she had once enjoyed began to sour. Anne's queenship, then, was both miracle and warning. She had risen higher than any court lady before her, shaping not only her husband's bed, but his conscience, his politics, and the fate of his realm. But in doing so, she had bound her destiny to the shifting tides of revolution. And revolutions are merciless. They devour their makers. The seeds of her downfall were already sown in the very faith she had championed. By placing herself at the heart of England's greatest transformation, Anne ensured that her legacy would be unforgettable, but also that her enemies, armed with the rhetoric of heaven and hell, would never cease to pursue her. Her crown was won not through peace but through fire, and fire once kindled can never be contained. As the incense faded from the chapels, as priests now swore loyalty not to the Pope, but to Henry, Anne stood at the height of her influence. She was queen, mother of the heir Elizabeth, and patroness of England's new religious order. Yet her throne was not built on stone, but on shifting sands. The passions of a king, the fury of the people, and the fragile hope that God's will would shine through her womb. Anne Boleyn had become far more than queen. She was the lightning rod of a nation in turmoil, a woman whose presence split England in two. And as the Reformation storm thundered on, it would soon become clear that the upheaval Anne had helped unleash could never again be contained. The story of Anne Boleyn, which had begun in triumph and glitter, now edged toward darkness. For every crown that gleams in the sun, there is a shadow waiting to claim it. By 1536, Anne's once unshakable hold on Henry VIII had begun to falter. Years had passed since her dazzling coronation, and though she had given Henry a child, Elizabeth, she had not provided the son he so desperately craved. Worse still, Anne had suffered miscarriages. One of them, in January of that year, was said to have been a male child. In Henry's eyes, this was no mere tragedy. It was a sign, an omen. The gods, or perhaps God himself, seemed to deny him the male heir he had torn his kingdom apart to obtain. Henry's disappointment curdled into weariness. The passion that had once driven him to challenge the Pope, defy kingdoms, and crown Anne queen now began to cool. At court, whispers stirred. Henry was looking elsewhere. A new woman had caught his attention, Jane Seymour, quiet, modest, pliant. Where Anne was fiery, Jane was demure. Where Anne was sharp-tongued, Jane was soft-spoken. To a king grown tired of quarrels and the weight of revolution, Jane seemed the very image of peace. But Henry's waning love alone would not have doomed Anne. Queens had fallen out of favor before, yet survived. What made Anne's position fatal was the rise of Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, a man both brilliant and ruthless, who had once been Anne's ally. Together, Anne and Cromwell had torn down the monasteries, redirected rivers of wealth from the church to the crown, and reshaped the religious life of England. Yet in the aftermath of victory, their alliance splintered. Anne had hoped the spoils of the monasteries would be poured into schools, hospitals, and charity for the poor. Cromwell, ever the pragmatist, intended them for the king's coffers, to strengthen royal power and finance wars. Their visions collided. Anne accused him of corruption. Cromwell accused her of meddling beyond a queen's rights. Their rivalry festered, and Cromwell, skilled in survival, sensed that if he did not strike first, Anne would one day move against him. By the spring of 1536, the court was a theater of suspicion. Anne's enemies circled like wolves. Catherine of Aragon was dead, yes, but her daughter Mary still lived, and her supporters longed for revenge. Many nobles resented the Boleyns' rise to prominence, and above all, Henry's gaze was drifting, his heart growing cold. Cromwell seized his chance. He began to weave a net of accusations around the Queen. If Anne could be destroyed, Jane Seymour could replace her, and Cromwell's own hold on power would be secured. And so he whispered to the king that Anne was not only barren and quarrelsome, but unfaithful, that she had dishonored Henry's bed with lovers among his own courtiers. The charges were shocking. Anne, accused of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn. The Queen of England, painted as a wanton conspirator, guilty of treason by betraying the king's body. The accusations were absurd, riddled with impossibilities. Some assignations were said to have taken place when Anne was recovering from childbirth, others when she was not even present in the same palace. But logic mattered little. What mattered was that the charges gave Henry what he needed: a legal justification to rid himself of the wife he no longer wanted. The arrests came swiftly. Musicians, courtiers, even Anne's own brother were dragged from their chambers, thrown into the Tower. Fear rippled across the court. Few dared to defend her. Fewer still would risk standing against Cromwell. Anne herself was taken to the Tower on May 2nd, 1536. As her barge drifted down the Thames, she passed beneath the Traitor's Gate. A bitter irony, for she entered not as a traitor, but as a queen. Her trial was a spectacle. Crowds gathered to see the once glorious queen humiliated. She stood tall, regal still, her black eyes flashing with defiance as the charges were read. Adultery, incest, high treason, the penalty, death. Anne denied everything. Her words were measured, her bearing proud. She reminded the court that she was the king's lawful wife, crowned by God's will, mother to his child. But the verdict had been decided long before the trial began. The jury, filled with her enemies, declared her guilty. Henry had his freedom. Cromwell had his victory. Anne's final days in the Tower were marked by dignity. She prepared for death with courage that even her enemies could not deny. On May 19th, 1536, she walked to the scaffold, clad in grey damask, her dark hair tucked beneath a simple headdress. She knelt, not before an axe, but before a French swordsman brought specially to end her life cleanly. Her final words were not of vengeance, but of submission. She prayed for the king's health, she asked God to protect Elizabeth, and she declared her innocence before heaven. Then, with one swift stroke, it was over. The morning of May 19th, 1536, dawned with an unsettling calm over London. The city, restless for weeks with rumors of the Queen's trial and fall, awoke to silence broken only by the distant toll of church bells. For those who lived near the Tower, the air itself seemed heavy, as though history itself was waiting to exhale. Inside the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn, once crowned Queen of England with trumpets and celebration, prepared for her final hour. Her rise had been meteoric, her influence transformative, but now her end was to be sudden, brutal, and public. The Tower's chapel bells rang softly as Anne dressed for her last appearance in this world. Witnesses recorded that she chose a gown of grey damask, trimmed in ermine, over a crimson kirtle. Around her shoulders she wore a mantle of ermine, the regal fur still signifying her status as queen, even as she walked to her death. On her head, a simple headdress framed her dark hair, which she had tucked away to bare her neck for the executioner's blade. Anne was not without courage. Indeed, every account from those present testifies to her remarkable composure. She had prayed through the night, preparing herself for what was to come. Her attendants, her women, who had remained with her throughout her imprisonment, were said to be inconsolable, weeping openly as they dressed her. Anne comforted them instead of seeking their comfort. She told them to dry their tears, for soon, she said, she would be in a place where no storm can shake me. At about 9 o'clock, Sir William Kingston, Constable of the Tower, entered her chambers. His expression was solemn as he told her the hour had come. Anne is said to have replied simply, "Master Kingston, I hear I shall not die afore noon, and I am ready to go at once." Then, with remarkable grace, she rose, steadied her trembling attendants, and prepared to walk into history. The scaffold had been built on Tower Green, an unusual honor. Traditionally, traitors met their end at Tower Hill before the jeering crowds of London. But Henry, whether out of mercy, love, or a desire to avoid riots, had commanded that Anne's execution be held within the walls of the Tower itself. There, only a select crowd of witnesses would see the Queen's final moments. The green was silent as Anne emerged. The crowd parted as she walked forward, flanked by Kingston and a small escort. Some later recalled that she walked with a queen's poise, head held high, her steps measured, as if she were approaching not death, but a stage upon which her last words would echo forever. The scaffold itself was draped in black. Upon it stood the French executioner, brought specially from Calais at Henry's command. Unlike the English axe, the Frenchman's sword promised a swift, clean death. It was, in its own grim way, a gesture of mercy. Anne mounted the steps. The crowd hushed. Even the ravens of the Tower seemed to still their wings. There she turned to face those assembled and spoke. Eyewitnesses, such as Edward Hall and chroniclers who later recorded her words, preserved the dignity of her final speech. She declared, "Good Christian people, I am come hither to die, according to law, for by the law I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I am come hither to accuse no man, nor to speak anything of that whereof I am accused and condemned to die. But I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never." Her words were remarkable. She uttered no bitterness, no accusations against Henry, no defense of her innocence. Instead, she submitted to the judgment of this world and placed her hope in God. Those present noted her calmness, her grace, and her extraordinary composure, as though she had already transcended the moment. After speaking, she turned to her ladies, who had followed her to the scaffold. They were in tears, trembling with grief. To them she said only, "I pray you, masters and all good friends, pray for me." Then, kneeling upon the straw that had been laid to absorb her blood, she prayed silently. The crowd gasped. Some wept, some crossed themselves, Others simply stood in stunned silence. One account recorded that her lips moved for a few moments after death, as if still in prayer. Her ladies, faithful to the last, gathered her body and head, wrapping them tenderly in white cloth. They carried her remains to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower grounds, where she was laid in an unmarked grave beneath the stone floor. No monument was raised, no ceremony honored her. A Queen of England, discarded, buried in haste. But the silence of that grave did not end her story. For though Anne Boleyn had died that morning, her influence had not. Her daughter, Elizabeth, still a child, would one day sit on the throne and rule England for nearly half a century, becoming the greatest monarch the Tudor dynasty would ever know. Anne's execution was meant to erase her, to blot out her name, to mark her as a failure, an adulteress, a traitor. Yet history has remembered her differently, not as the condemned woman of Tower Green, but as the queen who changed England forever, through her courage, her faith, and above all, through her daughter. As the sun set on May 19th, 1536, the blood of Anne Boleyn dried on the straw of the scaffold. Yet her shadow remained, stretching far beyond the tower walls, haunting the Tudor age and shaping the destiny of England itself. Anne Boleyn's life ended abruptly on the scaffold of the Tower of London in May 1536, but her story did not end there. Though her physical presence vanished, her influence rippled across decades, centuries, and even the very identity of England itself. She became more than a queen. She became a pivot on which the destiny of a nation turned, a figure whose courage, intelligence, and ambition would echo through history in ways she could never have foreseen. Her most immediate legacy was her daughter, Elizabeth, born into a world rife with suspicion, scandal, and the lingering shadow of her mother's fall. Elizabeth's existence alone was a testament to Anne's triumphs and tragedies. A child conceived amidst political upheaval, a child whose birth challenged the legitimacy of a king, a child whose very survival defied the odds. Elizabeth's early years were marked by uncertainty, her place in the royal succession questioned at every turn. Yet these formative experiences instilled in her resilience and political acumen, the same traits that had defined her mother's brief but remarkable rise. Elizabeth inherited more than blood. She inherited Anne's vision for an England transformed. The Protestant Reformation, which Anne had championed in her brief tenure as queen, laid the foundation for religious and political change. She had encouraged the translation of the Bible into English, promoted reformist scholars, and surrounded herself with advisors who questioned papal authority. Though her death was intended to end her influence, the seeds she had planted continued to grow. The dissolution of the monasteries, the consolidation of the Church of England, and the spread of Protestant thought all bore traces of her hand, even if history would initially credit her husband's decisions alone. Elizabeth, when she finally ascended the throne, carried her mother's legacy with conscious intention. As queen, she meticulously cultivated an image that would both honor and transcend Anne's memory. The Virgin Queen, a ruler whose authority derived not from marriage or dynastic alliance, but from intellect, political acumen, and personal resolve. Elizabeth's court, her policies, and her calculated public persona were all infused with a subtle homage to the mother she had never truly known, an acknowledgement of Anne's strength, daring, and vision. Yet Anne's influence extended far beyond her daughter. In literature, in portraiture, in folklore, and in the cultural memory of England, she became a symbol of ambition, intelligence, and the perilous allure of power. Historians and chroniclers have interpreted her life through countless lenses: a cunning seductress who manipulated a king, a martyr unjustly condemned, a political visionary, or a tragic figure caught in the merciless machinery of Tudor politics. Each generation that retells her story reshapes her image, reflecting contemporary anxieties, values, and ideals. From Shakespearean dramatizations to Victorian histories and modern feminist reinterpretations, Anne Boleyn remains a mirror reflecting the society that examines her. Even the very architecture and art of England bear witness to her legacy. The halls of Hampton Court, the remnants of palaces and estates she once graced, and the surviving portraits, illuminated manuscripts, and tapestries all speak to a queen who commanded attention, even in life and after death. Anne became a symbol for women who dared to assert themselves in a male-dominated world, an emblem of resilience and ambition, and a cautionary tale of how quickly favor can turn to fatal disfavor. Elizabeth's reign, the Elizabethan era, would see the full flowering of this legacy. England emerged as a global power, a center of commerce, culture, and maritime exploration. The Protestant Reformation that Anne had encouraged now defined the nation's spiritual identity. The literary Renaissance, scientific inquiry, and political consolidation of Elizabeth's reign all carried the echoes of the foundations Anne had laid, demonstrating that influence is not only measured in years, but in ideas, policies, and cultural transformation. Anne's story also serves as a moral and political parable. Her execution reminds us of the fragility of power, the danger inherent in ambition, and the cost of challenging entrenched authority. Yet her life proves that even in death, influence can endure. She shaped the political, religious, and cultural trajectory of a nation not through longevity, but through courage, intellect, and decisive action. Her legacy, ever evolving, continues to fascinate scholars, writers, and the public alike. Feminist historians view Anne as a proto-rebel, a woman who challenged gender norms and exercised agency in a world designed to constrain her. Political historians recognize her role as a catalyst for religious and governmental transformation, understanding that the ripples of her choices shaped a Protestant England. Artists, playwrights, and novelists have immortalized her, blending myth and history to create a figure both tragic and inspiring. Each reinterpretation demonstrates that Anne's story is not confined to a single historical moment. It is a living narrative, re-examined and reimagined with every generation. Ultimately, Anne Boleyn changed England not only through her marriage, her ambition, or even her tragic death, but through the living testament of her daughter Elizabeth and the enduring ideological transformations she helped set in motion. Her life, though brief, demonstrates the profound ways in which courage, intellect, and defiance can reverberate across centuries, shaping history long after the individual has passed. In examining Anne's legacy, one sees a tapestry woven from ambition, tragedy, courage, and innovation. The scaffold that ended her life became a stage upon which history turned, and the shadow of that queen stretches across the Tudor dynasty, Elizabethan England, and into the cultural memory of the modern world. Anne Boleyn's story proves that even in the most violent truncation of life, the imprint of one person's vision, daring, and resilience can transform an entire nation. Her legacy is not static. It continues to evolve. She is remembered as a queen, a mother, a political actor, a martyr, a revolutionary, and an enduring symbol of courage. Her story bridges centuries, connecting the Tudor court with Elizabethan England, the personal with the political, and the ambitions of one woman with the destiny of a nation. In death, she became legend, in history, she became eternal. Anne Boleyn remains a reminder that true influence is measured not by the span of life, but by the breadth of transformation one inspires.
Subscribe for more untold history.